Twitter told me to shift left in security yesterday. So I was looking at Twitter, as I do, and I came across the thread that you had put up there and a bunch of conversations around it. And it triggered a thought for me. You were talking a lot about shift left, specifically in the concept of security, the realm of security. And we have been hearing in technology for a while now, this idea of shift left. We should just shift left. And it's great. Everyone hears it, everyone says it, it's fantastic. But if I've noticed any one thing being in the DevNet zone this week, if I haven't heard anything else, it's, yeah, all those things you're telling me are great, but can you just tell me how to do X? And I thought it'd be really interesting to start there with you, is like, what does it mean to shift left, but specifically for security? Why is anyone even talking about this?
Yeah, I think the first fundamental is what is security? And I think fundamentally is this idea that our systems should work as designed and only as designed. And there's many layers in the stack in order to do that. Mm-hmm. And so when we think about shifting left, the question then becomes, what are we shifting left? And if we were to just think about security starting with the idea of what the policy should be, this app should only do these things. Great, where do we enforce that? Do I tell my developer to do that in their application code? Mm-hmm. Do I do that in the load balancer where the request is coming in and reject everything that isn't that? Or do I put it inside of my CI/CD system where I check to see if the code even does those things? Or do we put in all of those layers? Mm-hmm. And so I think what we're doing now though is saying, we have an idea, AKA our security policy, and we would like people downstream to implement it somehow. So we're going to shift that responsibility left. And I think that's the part that becomes unsustainable because it's not clear where do we implement these policies.
I was talking to a couple folks earlier from our Panoptica group, thinking specifically of application security, but it's still kind of in the same vein. And one of the things they brought up that I thought was really interesting, exactly leading into what you just said, is that in the concept of shift left, it's one, where do you do it? Shift it left, get it sooner in the process, but how do you prioritize it? What do you pick? And one of their comments was, yeah, you got to start someplace. You got to pick a thing to start with. You can scattershot and say, this team you do this team. The challenge with that is everybody needs to know sort of where they're going, and it almost makes sense to say maybe this isn't the right place to start with, but we're going to pick a thing that we're going to shift left on first, and we're going to try that. How are you seeing organizations, or in your role specifically, how are you seeing that prioritization happen? Are companies making the decision to say, maybe let's start here as opposed to over here?
No. Everyone's guessing. Everyone's buying all the things. Everyone's getting all the guidance from HIPAA, PCI, you name it, and you twist all the knobs in the direction that they tell you. But if you ask them, do you feel secure? The answer is no. Even though I've done all of those things, doesn't guarantee me much. It's more of due diligence. Mm-hmm. So I think we're shifting left the due diligence part. I'm saying is we want to get to actual security. So on the developer side, you're a developer, you're writing code. Ideally, you want to make sure that only the customer that's making that request sees their data and no other data for a simple feature.
Right.
That's kind of the extent of what you want. Now on the protocol side, is it an HTTP request? Where do you get this identity from? Mm-hmm. How do you know you can trust that identity? Then we start asking questions. Where should I implement it? Mm-hmm. Should I write that code every time for every request? Or should we move that into a framework used by every developer at the company?
Right.
Or should we put it in the network and let the network do deep packet inspection and say, hey, that's an invalid request. So if you were to lay out the attack surface and what we're trying to achieve, I think everyone involved in this process says, hey, I can do something at the load balancer. I can prevent requests from even visiting to your app. Great, let's do it there. But security's best done at layers. So you can't stop. So then we say, hey, where else can we do it? Well, we can have our libraries that pull the ID out of the HTTP header. Mm-hmm. We can have it also verify that that header can be trusted. Great, we'll also do it there. And now all of these policies become reusable bits. I can put them in each part of the platform. So if a new developer joins tomorrow and they say, hey, I want to start processing requests securely for this feature. Guess what? We've got you covered in these 4 or 5 layers. Be sure to use this library to get the identity of the customer that you're making that query on behalf of. You're going to probably be able to automatically pass our security audit. To me, that's the end game for all of this.
Something that's interesting about what you said, there's a lot of things interesting, but one of the things that John done me a little bit is if I get a little sort of abstract for a moment, it almost feels like a very practical, very deep implementation of John Doerr's OKR model, where what you're saying is, what you are saying, but what organizations can say is, we are trying to get to an outcome of be secure, whatever that means for us. However, we want each of you to say, how do you want to do that? What is your specialty? You said load balancing, service mesh, this other component, whatever it is. How are you going to implement that? And then that person or that team can say, here's how we're going to focus on it. And we're going to this is what we think we need to do right now. Great. We don't know what we should do. There's no big air quotes should. It's, this is what I can do now. And this is what I can do now. And then when it's done, you look and say, did that get us to where we think we need to be? If not, great. We have some other focus points we want to work on. But it's a really interesting way to codify a human model for here's how you're going to focus on that, rather than as a business saying, as you said, and I've companies I've worked for before, like, can you just make all this secure? Sure, absolutely. I threw a firewall in there. You're good. Like that's not how that works.
Yeah, it's like if you're building a house, you know what the entry points are. Mm-hmm. There are tools you can buy to protect those entry points. There are trade-offs to be made. Do you unlock the door or not? If you find that something happens, you ask yourself, maybe we need to add a camera, right? It's a practice. I think right now we're not really thinking holistically about what needs to happen, and when we do, where do we put the decision? Right now the decision is, hey, we did a vulnerability scan. Something turned red. We hand that report to someone and they make it turn green. Good, we get to do that forever. Versus a different system that says, well, how do you make it turn green? You pull in the updates automatically, and if that doesn't resolve the problem, then we raise it to someone's attention.
It is absolutely the classic dilemma of a SecOps or NetOps, where someone's like, I ran a Nessus scan, and I got this, and I told my boss, I checked it, look at this, here's the report. I plugged I'm the Dutch boy in the dike. I plugged all the holes, and they're like, thank you. You did a bunch of stuff. I appreciate you. Yeah, doesn't necessarily mean anything at all, because what were you trying to accomplish? Not just checking boxes, what were you actually trying to get to?
And I want to give something very concrete to people, because I think people understand this problem.
Yeah.
So I'm saying is, if you want to go into solution space, you've noticed that your company has been doing these vulnerability scans and patching for decades. And you're saying, Kelsey, how will we do it better?
Yeah.
This is where frameworks come in. If you look at like serverless platforms, for example, they tend to have the runtime incorporate all of these different layers. So you tell the development team, hey, what if I told you you don't have to deal with these low-level libraries anymore? Not the operating system, not your base image if you're using containers, but just the business logic, and we'll layer this piece underneath. And then what will happen is, going forward, you will never see these things because we can just patch those automatically, and it's gone from your workflow forever, unless one of our patches isn't compatible with your ability to process the business logic. That's a much better contract, and you end up with a better framework that incorporates all of these workflows and decisions.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that is the crux, and I really appreciate you making it so specific, because it is the hardest thing, I think, for everybody who's here right now, and just in general who's watching remotely, is I hear you say all these things, but what do I go do? And you breaking it down that way gives people the ability to say, okay, I think I know what I can go do a thing right now. Do I know it's the right thing? That doesn't matter, but I can do it. And now then I can do the next thing. That's really cool. I really, really appreciate that. Any final thoughts before we wrap up on what people should really take away from this?
There's this idea that collaboration is good no matter what. And I think this is where we get into trouble. It means that sometimes we don't define our domain and take care of our side of the house the best. If you're a network engineer, it's much better for you to provide an API for anyone that wants to interact with the network that encapsulate what the rules are. Am I allowed to ask for a set of IPs? If so, give me an API for doing that. If I need to give back some IPs, give me an API for doing that. If I need to open up ports for those IPs, give me an API to do that. In that API, if you were to take all of the policies, what ports are allowed and not, and allow me to discover that through the API interaction, what you've done now is you've scaled your expertise across the entire company forever, and we don't need to keep collaborating on something as simple as asking for firewall rules. And I think that's the end game. So you're not done, to me, until the API is there. So you can have the policy, you can have the knowledge, you can have the collaboration on what to do, but it isn't done until it's consumable by an API that doesn't require any more tickets or interactions to use it.
You know what? You're reinforcing the whole concept of API first, which is something I think all of us here really want. So thank you, Kelsey. I really appreciate you stopping by.
Awesome, thanks for having me.
Absolutely.